Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining the Applying for Graduate Scholarships Insider Academic Advice webinar. We've just started recording the event. We're just going to give it another 30 seconds or so before we get started. Okay, thank you. Okay, good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining this webinar entitled Applying for Graduate Scholarships Insider Academic Advice. This webinar will be featuring tips and suggestions from Professors Liz Nilsen and Kirsten Müller. My name is Heidi Mussar, and I'm the Associate Director of Graduate Financial Aid and Awards in Graduate Studies and Postdoctoral Affairs, and I'm going to be your moderator for this presentation. Today's webinar will be comprised of a formal presentation given by Liz Nilsen, our Assistant Vice President, Graduate Studies and Postdoctoral Affairs, followed by a Q&A period. During the Q&A period, Liz will be joined by Kirsten, who is the chair of the Department of Biology. Both Liz and Kirsten have lots of experience reviewing scholarship applications and have both participated on our Institutional Scholarship Selection Committee. I'm so grateful for their contribution to today's webinar. Thank you both. And assisting us behind the scenes during this presentation are my colleagues Miranda Bellata, Laura Frazee, and Elena Machado, who each manage scholarship competitions in GSPA, as well as Sarah Howard, who is the manager of postdoctoral affairs and programming development. Thank you, ladies, for your technical support and assistance in keeping an eye on the questions that are going to be coming in. Before we begin, let me give you a brief introduction about today's webinar. The session has been designed because we recognize the importance of ensuring our students are set up for success with applying for these competitive graduate scholarships. The session will give you important information preparing your scholarship application, especially with focus on preparing your research proposal, selecting referees who will write reference letters, the importance of publications and academic contributions, how special circumstances may or may not impact your application, the institutional adjudication process, and other available resources. During the presentation, we encourage you to ask any academic-related questions you may have. You can ask these questions by typing the question in the live Q&A section shown in the bottom of your screen. At the end of the presentation, we will take time to address as many questions as we can that have come in so that the entire audience can benefit. If we run out of time, and your question has not been answered or you have follow-up questions, please reach out to your department graduate coordinator or graduate officer or associate chair or your supervisor for assistance. And I see that, I believe, Sarah, if you could add the link to the coordinators and grad officers in the chat, that would be great. Additionally, your faculty associate dean will be available for a limited number of appointments on September 15th. So that's this Thursday from 1 o'clock to 3 o'clock for all faculties except environment, which will be on the 15th from 2:30 to 4:30. Details about making an appointment can be found on our website. And I do understand as of this morning that engineering and environment time slots are all booked. They're all booked now, while the remaining faculties each have a few slots available. And Sarah, if you could just add the link to that in the chat as well, if you haven't already, that would be great. If you require closed captioning, please click on the Show Captions button at the bottom of your screen to start viewing the closed captioning. Also, this presentation is being recorded and will be available on our website within a few days in case you wish to revisit any of the content presented here today. We would appreciate your understanding that a lot of information will be shared today. And although we are subject matter experts, nerves can come into play during a live presentation, and an inaccurate detail could be conveyed unintentionally. As such, I do encourage you to rely on our and the agency websites as the primary source of information. Finally, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that I live and work on the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. Our main campus is situated on the Haldeman Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. Our active work toward reconciliation takes place across our campuses through research, learning, and community building, and is centralized within the Office of Indigenous Relations. So without further delay, I will turn things over to you, Liz.
Thanks so much, Heidi. So welcome to all of our attendees. It shows real dedication to your success to be here. One of the really nice things about my role at the GSPA is that I get to support students in excelling, and this is one of those situations. So we're really interested in you doing well. So ask all sorts of questions. Professor Müller and I have sat on many committees and seen thousands of applications and have a good sense of what a committee is looking for in a strong application. So Heidi already gave the rundown of what we're going to be talking about today. And this is going to be a presentation around 15 minutes, and then we'll have lots of time for the Q&A. And yeah, as I said, ask any question, even if you think it's a really obvious one, or if you're just wondering about something. So one thing to note is that there is huge value in applying for scholarships. I think you are here because you see that value. So financing your education can be challenging, and this is one obvious way in order to take some of that pressure off. But beyond that, applying for and receiving scholarships is a way of building up your CV. It's a way of communicating externally when you move forward that there has been a committee that has done some sort of evaluation and has deemed you as being having a lot of potential and success. So that's really important. Okay, so we'll move forward. So what we are going to be talking about today is what makes an excellent application. And so the research proposal is a really big part of it. And the main thing when you are doing your research proposal is that you want to make the information digestible for your audience. And so we're going to be talking about who actually sees your application, and that's going to give you a good sense of how to pitch things. So it's this balance between providing enough technical detail that your readers understand that you know what you're talking about, but being able to be general enough that someone who is outside of your discipline is able to understand what you are doing. So there's a couple of ways that you can make your application and your proposal more digestible or more accessible for your readers. So just kind of some structural things. So first of all, you can use subheadings, and this is just a way of kind of grouping your information. Even if you don't use subheadings, you're going to want to have a really clear organization to the flow of your proposal. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that on the next slide. So when we're thinking about subheadings, you might want to do something like identify when it's background information, identify when it's your research objectives, clearly note your methodology, and then say something about contributions or significant at the end. And that makes it a really clear layout as people are going through. Some of these headings may not apply to you, so don't feel like you have to force things into little sections if that isn't relevant to the proposal that you have. You may wish to use images. And so by images, I mean, if there is a figure or some sort of theoretical model that you have that if you tried to explain it would take a whole page and you don't want to be using up all that space to explain it, you can include that there. Don't just throw something in there that's going to create more questions for your readers, because that is not going to be effective. You want to say, am I somehow providing information about something that is going to make it so that when I say these sentences, it's much more clear what I'm talking about. And I can do it in a much more concise way because I have that figure. So only use that if it is going to be clear. And if it's going to be so small that you can't even see it, then that's not going to be effective. So don't put it in there. So it's really that balance between, is it worth using up that space that you would be using up where you could be saying a few things to provide that. So be concise without leaving out important details. So I know because I work with students and because I was a student at one point in time, that we get really, really stuck on details. And we know how all these things are really important to the design that we have. And sometimes you just have to let go of some of those details so that someone else can come in and understand sort of the overall picture of what you're talking about. So again, you want to show that you have thought through some of the key issues of your proposal, but you don't need to be including things like every single formula that you're going to be using. If there's, and if you're talking about interviews, you can give a couple examples of the sort of content area, but you don't have to give all the interview questions, that type of thing. So one thing that we see, and this is partially a strategy, I think, to save space, is using acronyms. And I would say using one or two acronyms is fine. You will want to make sure that you clearly define what you mean early on in your proposal. And then when you're using them, you don't use too many. When there are too many acronyms in there, again, this makes it less accessible for your reader. And they're going to have to keep referring back up to say, like, what is this that they're referring to? And as soon as you start making your proposal difficult to read, people are losing interest in the important work that you are doing. So avoid acronyms if you can. It kind of depends on the acronym too. Like some acronyms we say them as part of, as if they're a word in themselves. So if I think, some of my students in the past have written proposals where they're talking about populations of children with ADHD. In the public, we use the phrase ADHD. So I wouldn't be worried about them using that in a proposal because I actually think it would probably make it less accessible if they wrote out the entire one. The other thing is jargon. And so jargon is when it's discipline-specific terminology that not everyone is going to understand. And if you have too much of that, it clogs up what you are trying to say for a reader. So again, people in your area might know exactly what you're talking about, but it's not just people in your area who's going to be reading that. So really make sure that you make the language digestible for a knowledgeable audience who is outside of your discipline. In terms of the way that you frame things, you want to use more definitive type of language rather than conditional language. So rather than saying that you'd like to do something or you hope to do something, you say, this is what I will do. When I receive this funding, I will do this. And the benefit of that is that it conveys confidence and it makes it seem like a reader says, like, yes, I can see what this person is gonna do, and it's gonna happen, and it instills confidence in the proposal itself. And lastly, check your spelling and your grammar, and do so throughout your application, not just your proposal. So I can think of many times where a proposal is very well polished, and then when it gets to the section where you have to talk about relevant experience or in the lay abstract and you see spelling errors and you know that this person has spent a lot of time making sure that their proposal doesn't have any typos or spelling, but the other sections haven't received the same sort of care. And these are competitive awards, especially when they get to the national level. Everyone is a very strong applicant. And when there are spelling errors or grammar errors, it's an easy way for a committee to rule out an application. And you definitely don't want your application to be one that is ruled out. So what would I recommend? Have other people look over your work. And we're going to get to that in a sec later. I would also say take breaks from writing your proposal so that you come back to it with fresh eyes. And one thing that I do still before I submit any sort of manuscript is I print out a hard copy and I go through it. And almost always I will find things that I missed when I was reading it on the screen. So it's just like another way of looking at it. Okay, so this is more about the content of your proposal. So really what we want applicants to do, or what a strong applicant will do, is they will create this balance of what is the work that they are proposing and how are they going to do it and why is it important? And so being able to convey those main things is key. And so I was talking at my last lab meeting to my students and I asked, what is the most difficult thing for you for writing a research proposal? And they said, it's figuring out the bigger picture and it's figuring out the impact. And so I would say a couple pieces of advice for that. One is when you are sort of allocating time to writing your proposal, make sure that you allocate enough time to that bigger picture type of question, and not just working on the details of the methodology, because it takes a long time. Even though it's only going to be a few sentences in your proposal, it takes a really long time and a bit of a process to come up with how am I positioning this in the larger important questions of our time or of my discipline or of society, that type of thing. The other thing I would say is use discussions with your supervisor to get at these types of questions. Again, I feel like a lot of time we spend talking about making sure that our conditions are well counterbalanced and we're controlling for things that we want to control and we're asking all these little questions. And just kind of purposefully stepping back and saying, can we have a conversation about where this work is positioned in the larger discipline, and have that conversation there. And then the other thing I'll say is take a look at previous examples, especially ones from people who have the same supervisor as you, to see how have they positioned some of their work. And then in terms of a process, channel your inner 5-year-old. And so what I mean by that is that 5-year-olds ask why all the time. And then you answer that question and they will ask why again. And then you'll answer that question and they'll ask why again. So think about, why am I studying this? And then follow up with that question of, why is that important? And then answer that question to be, now why is that important? And that will take you further out from your specific question and allow you to look at it with that different lens, and that lens that's really important for your readers. So how to structure things, and this is not talking about necessarily the subheadings you use, but just the general flow that you will want to your proposal. People use the analogy of like an hourglass or a martini glass, where at the top, you are starting wide and you're starting with that big picture. So that's the brim of the glass. Like, where is your work situated? What is the general topic that you have? What is the larger research question or the overall goals that you have? And then you get down into your specific problem or issue or question, clearly define those, and then tell us how you're going to go about answering those questions. And you want to make sure that you give us enough detail that as a reader, we will understand, yes, this person understands how what they are proposing to do is going to answer the question that they just identified that they would like to address. And you can also talk about how you're going to collect your data, how you are going to analyze your data. That allows us to know that you've been really thoughtful and you've kind of taken your project through to the end. You just haven't picked a topic because it's interesting and then kind of let it float. Here, one of the things that we look at is what is being described feasible or realistic for the student? So for instance, if you are in a master's program and you have 2 years, you don't want to be proposing some huge longitudinal study because that is not realistic that you are going to be able to design it, collect your data, and then be producing it before the end of your time. If, however, you are using a collected data set and you're analyzing it in a unique and novel way that has longitudinal data, tell us about that, because otherwise we will assume that you are thinking that you are going to collect that and it's therefore seen as less feasible. So if you are using some existing data set, you can mention that, and that allows us to know, yes, even though this is a huge scope for the project, that it's going to be realistic that this person is going to be successful. So that's the stem of the glass. So then, of course, your glass has to be able to stand up. So there's a base at the bottom, and that's where you say, here's the bigger picture, here's how I'm going to address this question. And now if I address this question, here is where the impact is. This is why it's an important question to ask. And this is how it's going to benefit society, or it's going to benefit our understanding of health or our understanding of global issues. What is the reason why you are looking at this? And what sort of impact will your work have? What's the meaning of your work? And then you end with that. And if you follow that flow, that allows someone to really get behind your work and end on a strong note. I think sometimes people, they end in a note where they provide a little bit of a biography right at the end. I've noticed that sometimes what people do. And I would say end with your strongest point, which is how your work is important, and leave that. Okay, so the importance of the lay abstract. So the lay abstract is that paragraph that is in the beginning of your application where you describe what you are going to do. Don't ignore this section. Don't copy and paste from your proposal into that section because that shows that someone did not take the time to summarize their work. Here is where you want to be even more accessible than for the proposal. So you have to remember that people are reviewing lots and lots of applications. And I'll say, like, my personal way is I use the lay abstract as a way to kind of shift gears from one application to the next. So I've just read something and it's on, I don't know, public health policy or something like that. And then I'm starting something new. And so I'll look at the lay abstract and I'll have to shift and be like, oh, okay, so this is about, feminist theory in like 18th century literature or something like that, and it allows to sort of switch off what that other person was doing, and now I'm thinking of this work here, and so make sure that that is a way that you're enabling someone to kind of jump into your application in a really clear way. So avoid jargon and capture your audience's interest right away, and have someone else review that as well. Like, so when you're kind of sending out your materials for a review, send that out as well, because you don't want to set up a negative expectation because you have typos within your lay abstract there. Okay, so here's where obtaining feedback from supervisors, colleagues, peers outside of your discipline, have a different lens on it. You can ask people, can you please tell me some information? Does my methodology seem sound in this? Or you can say, does this seem well positioned? Do you understand the importance of this work? And be clear about the feedback that you would like to get. And a big plug for our Writing and Communication Center. They have workshops on writing research proposals. You can do one-on-one sessions with them. There's a lot of value of connecting with them. Okay, so referees. So these are the people who are going to be writing letters for you. So before you ask anyone, you take a look at the scholarship requirements to make sure that this individual is suitable. Pretty much across all of our awards that we adjudicate here, there is at least one person needs to be an academic reference, but there may be importance in having a professional reference for something. And so if you are going to have a professional reference of someone who's outside of academia, You might need to provide them a little bit more information about what you are planning to do in your academic training so that they can make that link. And they can sort of say, this is what they did, and these are the leadership things that they showed. And now I'm so pleased that they're going to be following up in this way. And I think that makes a really strong application to say, outside of academia, they did this, and now they're kind of channeling this energy and this curiosity they have in this academic way so that it doesn't seem really disconnected. So who would be someone who knows you well from an academic perspective? If you've worked on individual projects with people, so an honor supervisor or your current research supervisor, if you worked with them for a while, that's obviously someone who's going to know you well. If you are just starting out in master's, you can think back to when you were in your undergrad. Were you in a small class? Was there a lot of discussion? Did you do well in a class? You could ask them. Someone who would know you less well would be from a larger second year class where there was hundreds of people, and they might not be able to speak to all of your strengths in that way. So request your references early. We get a lot of requests for letters, so you want to make sure that you check in and give people lots of time to write your letters, and provide them with information that will enable them to write a really strong letter for you. So I have volunteers in my lab who often ask for letters. And one thing that I always ask them to do is write a summary of what they did, because sometimes they've worked with graduate students and I'm not completely aware of the activities they have. So if they send me something that says, here's the dates that I worked and what I did, that's really valuable, and it allows me to write a stronger letter. Provide them with examples of leadership and mentorship. The selection criteria for awards often involves leadership or interpersonal qualities. And so these may be things that people who you work with academically don't know about you. So you'll want to make sure that you include those, and also include information that they might not know. So examples of attributes. So it could be, competitive sports that you played, or artistic or musical pursuits that you have. And that allows them to be able to include those things because, again, they get included in some of the evaluation criteria that happens there. And also, I would say highlight things for them that you might want to put in a letter. So for instance, in most applications, you can't include a manuscript publication unless it's already submitted. But there might be one that's really close to submission, or a couple that are close to submission. And you could say, but a referee could include that information in their letter saying, they had this huge project and they wrote it up independently and it's going to be submitted soon. And then that's a way of inserting that into your application while still kind of following the rules around what you can report on your CV or not. And remind them of deadlines. It doesn't seem rude if someone says, here are some clear deadlines at all, and make sure to thank them afterwards. We all know that this is part of our job, and there is an expectation that especially in the fall, we need to dedicate a chunk of time to be writing them. But I think especially if you're asking someone who hasn't written a letter before, it's a huge time commitment, and it makes sense to thank them for that time. Okay, publications and contributions. I think this is an area that can create some stress for students, especially when they're just starting out and they say, I've heard publications are really important and I don't have any. Does this mean I'm automatically not going to get a scholarship? And I would say no. Publications are important because they demonstrate some sort of research potential and some sort of past research success. So same with conference presentations. These are useful to have. But there are other ways that you can demonstrate your potential by talking about other types of activities that you had, other sort of outputs, other sort of community engagement or exhibits and things like that you've done. A clear point that I want to make is that we always take into account where you are at in your academic training and what discipline you are from, because the expectations for publications differs across the disciplines. And it's not as simple as even like, STEM versus humanities or something like that, because there's a lot of differences between, different departments and that. We know that it's going to take way more time to do a single author publication, which is more typical in the humanities, than it would to be working in a very active lab where there's, 10 or 15 authors on manuscripts in that way. And then, of course, we would have higher expectations for individuals who are in their PhD and later stages of that versus people who are just starting out. It would be pretty rare to have students who are just coming out of undergrad to have publications. It's great if you have them, but it's definitely not something that we would expect to see. On your applications, you'll often have to differentiate between peer-reviewed versus non-peer-reviewed output. And the reason for that is they're seen as a little bit different. Like peer-reviewed goes through a process. There's colleagues who have evaluated the work in some particular way. It often can take a longer process, so a longer length of time. There can be some very impactful non-peer-reviewed work. And so those are taken into account. But you might need to do a little bit more about, say, like, how is it impactful in some particular way? So yeah, that just kind of gets to the third point there, which is, while publications are important, there's other impactful outputs that can be key, and we do take those into consideration. If you look at the selection criteria, so like for the Tri-Council Awards, for example, there is a balance between the research potential and then also that sort of relevant experience that you have in academic and non-academic activities. And so make sure you report all of those and highlight what it is that you are doing, not just as in, here is the title that I had in this position, but when you are given room to expand on it, tell us about how you demonstrated leadership, how you demonstrated dedication in some particular way, how you contributed to the training of other people and were a mentor, how you created something new. So maybe you were a TA and you created a manual for other TAs. That's important, and that's a bit different, and it's going to make you stand out from just noting that you did have a TA position. And so most of the, like if you go into the Tri-Council website, they'll list all of the sorts of activities that you'll want to include in that. Special circumstances. It has a different name in different competitions. I think it's called allowable inclusions for SSHRC. And so this refers to times when there may have been an interruption to your academic progress or some sort of impact on your progress or on the sort of grades that you have at there's like a kind of a gap in your grades. So something happened that was a circumstance that made it so that your strength that you've demonstrated at other times didn't come through at that time. So you are allowed to do that, and definitely it's recommended to do it if it's relevant to you. You want to make sure that you don't choose things that are more minimal types of things that draw attention to something that you don't necessarily need to draw attention to. So if you generally had very high grades and you got a slightly lower grade, don't put that in the special circumstances, because probably the committee wouldn't even have noticed that grade anyways. And then it draws attention to something that we wouldn't have seen. So you just leave it. I think people probably have questions about COVID here. We know COVID has affected everybody in some way to varying degrees. So think about, was your research progression affected in a way that is substantially different than other people? And that would be the criteria that you would be using here. Okay, so what happens in when we receive the awards? So before the institution receives awards, note that they have been reviewed by your department. So that's where there are individuals who are within your discipline who have seen your application and reviewed it. And then it comes to our institutional committee that's made up of the Associate Deans of Grad Studies from all of 6 faculties. It's also the Assistant Dean, my role, and then the other person in the role, and then it's chaired by the Associate VP of the GSPA. So your applications are read by two members, one from inside your faculty and one from outside. Then we combine those scores, and we will see those scores that or those applications that the high scores move forward. Those that have the lowest scores, unfortunately, don't move forward. And then there's a lot in the middle where we will then come together and discuss and come to some sort of decision about who moves forward and not. Know that we take our job very seriously. We probably spend about 15 minutes on every application to go through that. That is a limited amount of time. So that's where you want to make it accessible, and you want to make it really clear the importance of your work. When there are discrepancies, we'll often have bring other people in order to review them and make sure that we feel comfortable with the choices that are made. Okay, so there are tons and tons of resources at UW to make sure that you are successful in your applications. We love sending out our applications because we feel really good about them. We feel like they showcase the wonderful work that happens at the University of Waterloo. And actually, that's one thing that's really nice about reviewing all of your applications, is seeing all the exciting work that's happening. And I often want to reach out to students and connect them with other students from other areas, because they are working on things that would so nicely come together. So there are lots of resources. You can take a look at sample proposals on the SharePoint site. There's information on the GSPA scholarship web pages. There are the appointments with the faculty associate deans that Heidi mentioned. I've already talked about the Writing and Communication Center. And then you can certainly contact any of the individuals who are on this call. They are our scholarship competition experts, and they are an incredible team that is very dedicated to supporting our students. And they are all behind the scenes here. Their names have already been mentioned. Here is who they are: Miranda, Laura, Elena, and Heidi. And certainly do reach out if you have questions, and they are more than willing to help you. So we are now at the question and answer period. I am going to stop sharing my screen. And Professor Müller is joining us. And maybe before we get to the Q&A, I'll ask Kirsten if you have anything that you wanted to add. One thing I should note for our attendees is that my background is in the Faculty of Arts, and Kirsten's is in the Faculty of Science. So we thought it would be good to have us both on the call in case there are different perspectives about how the applications and proposals might look. So Kirsten, if there's anything you'd like to add, please feel free to do so.
Thanks, Liz. Just a few comments. And yes, I'm coming from a STEM perspective. So I wanted to also touch on impact. And a lot of times when we think of impact, we're thinking of broad societal impact. But I remember some of the proposals coming out of pure math and conveying societal impact in pure math might be a challenge, or might be a challenge coming out of biology where you're studying one particular small molecule. So that's where you could actually say impact to the field, and you could really break it down for someone, keeping in mind who your audience is with these proposals, but you could say this is what the impact will be in the field. The next point is audience. No matter what you're doing, no matter how you're communicating or what you're communicating, whether it's a grant proposal, whether it's a presentation, whether it's a blog, or whether it's a research paper, you should always think about who is your audience. And so Liz has done a great job here in explaining that what the institutional committee looks like, that also within departments, there's a committee that reviews these proposals. Now, the breadth of disciplines within departments can be incredibly huge. So that can also mean that there may be someone reading your proposal who has no background or expertise in your particular area. So you want to be able to convey that information to those individuals, whether it be in your department, whether it be in an institutional committee or a national committee. For example, I study seaweeds. The likelihood of someone at a national level being on a committee that studies seaweeds is highly unlikely. So keep in mind getting your point across to a broad audience, and engage your supervisor and lab members on that as well. And then from a STEM perspective, one thing that we always look for in NSERC proposals is around clear objectives and clear hypotheses. If you don't know what your hypotheses are, that's okay. But having clear objectives that you're going to address in your research are really critical as well. And one last point, if you have a draft of your proposal, share it with your referees. It's really useful for them to see what you're proposing as part of your entire package that's going forward for a scholarship.
Thanks, Kirsten.
Thanks.
Heidi.
Well, thank you, ladies, very, very much. That was very informative. Really appreciate your vantage points of being on the institutional selection committees and having reviewed thousands of applications. So thank you very much for your perspective. We do have a number of questions that have come in. So I've tried to categorize them by topics. So let's just kind of kick things off here. So Liz, over to you here. How do you assess applications within the same competition for applicants who are at different stages of their degree or different degrees? So master's versus doctoral, or if somebody's currently in an undergrad planning to maybe go directly into a PhD.
Yeah, so that speaks to that point of where we would expect someone to be. So we might expect that if someone is a little bit further along, that their proposal might even include some preliminary data collection that is kind of ongoing. I think if they're quite far into their PhD and they're still talking about proposing something that's going to happen, that doesn't seem as strong. Whereas if someone is just starting out, we kind of understand that there's a little bit of fluidity to where they're at, and that it might be subject to change. And then as well, we wouldn't necessarily expect that there's going to be publications at earlier stages. But I would say in terms of the clarity of writing, we would expect that to be strong regardless of where someone is at. So that's really important. It's not that we see the writing of the application, we would judge that in a different way. We would want that to be solid at all stages.
Okay. And I think the key too is like the candidate pool differs every year, you know, the number of applications, the quality of the applications. So people are asking like, I'm just starting out in my program. This is the first term of my PhD. Do you recommend that I apply, or should I further develop my research proposal, and gain more experience before submitting an application? Do you have any further thoughts on that?
Yeah, so two thoughts I have. One is that a lot of our competitions are divided. So we have the CGSM and then we have the doctoral awards. And so for some of those awards, we're only looking at a pool of applicants who are in a particular stage of their training. The other thing that I would say is always apply, because it is going to give you practice, even if you are not successful one year, and it's going to make it so much easier for you the second year. You are familiar with the types of things that you need to provide. You have sort of some rough ideas of things. So there is a huge amount of value in going through the process. And I think when you have individuals who are applying to graduate school, and so they might be in their undergrad and they are applying to graduate schools, it looks good when people have applied for scholarships because it shows that they are aware of the value of this process and that they have some understanding of it. So it conveys a lot just by applying.
Okay.
Can I add something there, Heidi?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize that we recognize you're applying for scholarships. You want to get the scholarship, but I just want to emphasize what Liz said. This is practice, and practice writing these proposals and writing up these applications are a real critical element of your development as a graduate student. And so even if you don't get it, save all those documents. You can apply next year or the year after, or you can use that information to apply for other scholarships. It's all useful going through this process.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Kirsten. another question on research. Actually, sorry, let me just flip over here to some referee questions. Maybe Kirsten, since you're still on camera here, I'll just ask you. For Waterloo students, if a scholarship asks for community reference that can't be a peer, who do you ask? I've been an exec at multiple UW clubs, but never interacted with anyone in administration for the clubs.
Yeah, that one I might pass over to Liz because I'm not sure about, typically with the science ones, we don't often have community. The types of references that we get that are non-academic within the sciences tend to be maybe employers that you had as a co-op student, or maybe an employer that you had where you were doing a research program over the summer, or if you were involved in maybe activities that were tied to community volunteering where you would have someone. But Liz, maybe you can answer that about community on campus. I don't know that an undergraduate or another graduate student would be a relevant reference, but that might differ within SSHRC.
Yeah, I mean, I would check the criteria for that. I would say that if you have a peer, even if it's another peer who is engaged in some sort of leadership role, that may not come across as strong as another individual. I think I would be more inclined to choose an academic reference, but then give them a lot of details about the sort of leadership activity that you did so that they can speak to that. Because when people are peers, we don't have an ability to differentiate. Are they, you know, your friend that just happens to be on a committee together, or is it a more of a supervisory relationship in that way? So again, I would check what the criteria is for the award, and when in doubt, I would tend to err on the side of caution and not choose someone who's a peer.
Okay, thank you. Liz, for special circumstances, how do we write something like stating that mental health issues actually cause problems without making it sound like an excuse? Or how do we talk about something that might cause an unconscious bias due to stigma?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I realized when I went through that section, there was a couple things that I wanted to add to that. And so one is, if you are clear about the dates, that it was within a particular period of time, and then you can speak to there being sort of a change or a gap. And that, so I think that's, someone can see that that is there. The other thing is, you don't need to provide a lot of details, and we would actually prefer that people don't provide specific details about medical or health information. I would say, if it is something where you feel like this has actually impacted it, that you state it. And our committee has gone through bias training, and so we are mindful of these sorts of considerations when we are reviewing the applications. If it's something that you know that just happens to coexist, that you have mental health problems and you are in school, but you don't think those two are impacting the other, then you don't need to include it. Just because there is circumstances doesn't mean that it has to be included. It's up to you. But if it is a clear sort of impediment to your making progress in a particular area, then you should feel comfortable to include that information. Again, you can just say health problems if you don't want to include mental health problems. You don't need to include the details.
Okay, thank you. Kirsten, over to you for a moment. Again, sticking with special circumstances, how do we explain if we had to change our dissertation topic halfway through the PhD? It makes it sound like we're just starting out despite being far along already, which sounds like it might be a problem. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so that has become much more a bigger issue during COVID. There's been a lot of interruptions where human participant research has been shut down, but also field research has been completely shut down for 2 years. And I think providing a simple explanation, it could also be that equipment was no longer available for you to do that work. So that is something you could include in the proposal, or you could also include that under special circumstances, where you just explain, you don't need to go into a lot of detail, that this is the circumstance that caused a shift in my proposal. Don't belabor it. You don't need a huge long paragraph, 1 or 2 sentences. My research was interrupted due to lack of availability of this equipment or due to COVID or whatever it is. Therefore, I shifted my dissertation to focus on these topics that can be addressed within a timely fashion. Something like that. Keep it simple. You don't need to give a whole lot of detail, just right to the point. And then it doesn't look like you're making excuses. It's like, oh, I had this circumstance happen and I addressed the circumstance and now I'm moving on. And it's the same thing. We run into this as researchers when we're putting forward our research grant proposals. We also have a special circumstances section, and so we tend to keep things simple, and we don't provide tremendous amount of detail, but just that you're moving forward, and this is where the direction that you're going. And we all understand this. We've all had interruptions in our lives as well, and so I do recommend using that special circumstances section and addressing some of those points, but do it briefly. You don't need to go into a lot of detail, and you don't need to share personal information.
Okay, thanks. And since I still have you, a student here is asking, I did my master's in 2018 and started my PhD in this year, 2022. Should they address the gap in their special circumstances? And we have encountered that before. You know, students, this is their they're coming out of a career, decided to further their education. How can they address that?
So I don't view that really as a gap. That is, you've gone and done, graduate work and you're coming back to do a PhD, and that is really not uncommon. There's many people that might take decades in between doing a master's and doing a PhD. And that is a point where you can talk about, you had a career and you decided at some point during your career that you wanted to go on and do PhD work. So I don't view that as a gap. That's just part of life, and people change different paths as they go through in life. And there's absolutely nothing unusual about that at all.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I agree that wouldn't be something that you would include within the special circumstances or allowable inclusions. I think someone can talk about in the relevant experience area, can speak to the fact that they took some time out, they did this work in a professional setting, and then some of the experience that they had there, enabled their ideas or their curiosity to pursue it and a PhD and come back. And I see that as a real strength and something that is of value.
Okay, thanks. Another question has just come in, still with special circumstances. If you've had a significant life event happen that didn't cause a gap in your academic record, it didn't impact grades or cause a gap, but impacted your ability to publish perhaps as much as you should have, should you address this in your special circumstances?
Is that for me, Heidi?
Sure. Yeah.
You could, but I would think about, I don't know what this situation is, like what length of time. I mean, there are situations that come up for people that are of a short time period. And I think if you start talking about not being able to publish within that short time period, it just highlights to a reviewer that you have fewer publications than you might expect to have. So I think there's sort of some weighing of, was this substantially impacting my publication record in this, particular way that was over a long-standing period of time. I think you could speak to that. I mean, some people have different sorts of obligations, like during COVID, they might have had the responsibility of caring for older parents or for children. And so it is understandable if during that time you didn't publish quite as much. And I think that that would be something that is different than other students, and you could speak to it. But you just have to think of, is this beyond what is the situation for other people? And am I highlighting something that I want to be highlighting?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to switch topics over to research proposal. So Liz, about avoiding jargon, how would a student know what the knowledge base is of the reader who's reviewing the application? So if they're doing mathematical formulas and applications that are usually read by mostly read by people in the same field, isn't avoiding jargon indicative of a lack of field knowledge?
Yeah, I understand that question. And I think that, again, you have different audiences that you need to write for. And it may be fine to have sections in the middle where you are getting into the technical details to show you really know what you're talking about, and you need to use appropriate language for that area. However, you don't want to start at that level. You want to start broader to bring people who may not be in your area into understanding what you do, and then kind of get into those details. If there's another way of saying it or another way of providing just sort of a quick definition so that you are explaining some of the technical language, that would be useful to do as well. But I think the main thing is not just diving into a very detailed technical type of proposal, because there are people who are going to be reading it who are outside the field.
Okay.
But yes, I mean, I agree. If there's like technical language and then you start using something that's so layperson, it might be like, do they even know what they're talking about? So I understand needing to find that balance there. Kirsten, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to go back to what I mentioned earlier about impact. And again, you may not have broad societal impact. You may not even have broad discipline impact, but it might be within your narrow field that there will be real impact from the work that you're doing. And so thinking about tying off your proposal with, this is really important in my field because of blah, 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 and being really clear about what the impact is. And that'll end your proposal on a really strong note. I recognize particularly, and I've read a lot of those pure math proposals when I was at the institutional committee, that it's conveying the information is really technical. But what I looked for in a lot of those is, what's the impact in your field? How is this going to be interpreted within your field? Why is it relevant for your particular field? And if that can come across clearly, that really is a much more effective way of communicating the importance of the work that you're doing.
Okay, thank you. There is a question here that I can tackle, and then if you have something else to add, that would be great. What do I do if I feel like my research could fall under more than one of the tri-agencies? Which one do I apply to? So usually when we get asked that question, it's like, okay, send us, a brief 1-page summary or half a page summary, and we're happy to send it to, the tri-agency to make sure that it does fall under that agency's mandate, or, also checking with your supervisor, checking with the department, right? But do you have anything else to add to that, Kirsten?
Yeah, no, I think it's really looking for what the tri-agency requires. I seem to recall in the past too that you would often share those, Heidi, with myself or Liz or whoever was in the assistant VP role, and we could discern that as well. But I recommend having a conversation with your supervisor, because your supervisor also may be pulling research funds. So from either NSERC or CIHR, there may be overlap, and they might be able to give you a bit of a feel for which agency you should be looking at as well.
For sure. Thank you. Where in the research proposal should I include a description of what I did in my master's thesis in methodology, and how I will extend that in a doctoral dissertation?
Yeah, I can speak to that.
Liz, sure.
So I think if one of your goals within your proposal is to talk about your research program in kind of a broader way and show that you have learned something, done something with it, and now your doctoral work is in a meaningful way extending that work, that it makes sense to talk about that, because then again, the reader kind of understands the trajectory you're on, and also has confidence that you're able to do what you are proposing to do because you have just told us about some really clear way in which you've had experience in this area. So I think that's useful. Where it might be a little bit less useful is if you're switching gears completely and then you kind of break up the flow of your proposal. So again, you kind of want to weigh out, are there other places where I could talk about this work? I mean, I have the relevant experience section where I could speak to my master's work, and I don't need to include it in my proposal so that it's breaking up the flow of the content in the area that I'm talking about. Or does it actually add strength to the work that I'm going to be proposing? And so I would use that to decide. I don't think there's a clear answer of whether you should or shouldn't include that information. Kirsten,
Okay.
would you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I don't have anything to add.
Okay.
Thanks, Liz.
Okay, so actually, I'm just going to give you ladies a break for right now. I'm just going to interject with some statistics and quotas because a lot of people like data. So just to give our audience an idea, this year for the master's competition, are the number of applications or awards that we can offer for the CIHR Masters is 7. We can award 50 NSERC Masters and 36 SSHRC Masters. For the tri-agency doctoral, so these ones are where there's a national committee, and so we collect the applications and we send forward a limited number based on our institutional quota. So for CIHR doctoral, we can send forward 5. For NSERC, it's 132. SSHRC, it's 39. And Vanier, whose deadline is tomorrow, is we can send forward 2 for CIHR, 13 for NSERC, and 7 for SSHRC. So these are very competitive. There's a national level adjudication. So the national committee members, they receive applications from all over the country and they read them, and then they make a decision as to which applicants are successful. So just to give you an idea, last year on the number of applications that we received, so for the master's CIHR, we were allowed to give out 7. We received 30 applications. For NSERC, we were allowed to award 50 and we received 253 applications. And the SSHRC Masters, our quota was 37 and we received 135. For the doctoral CIHR, we could forward 5 and we received 31 applications. NSERC, we received 156 applications and could send forward 132. And for SSHRC, we received 122 applications and could send forward 39. For OGS, which is the Ontario Graduate Scholarship, which is open to domestic and international students, we typically receive over 1,000 applications in total for those. Last year, our institutional quota for OGS, sorry, I'm just going to back up. For OGS, it used to be a provincial competition, but a number of years ago, the province downloaded the competition to the institution. So every provincial institution receives a quota, and then we award those just institutionally. So last year, our quota was 167 for OGS, and 5 could be awarded to international students. 2 are reserved specifically for applicants who self-identified as Canadian Indigenous students. And we actually allocate 160 to the 6 faculties who make the final selection. Our quota for the QE2 GSST, which is the Queen Elizabeth II Graduate Scholarship in Science and Technology, that quota was 36, and those are only open for domestic students in the STEM disciplines. We don't have the allocations yet for the OGS as of today. Hopefully they'll be coming shortly, and then we will update our website accordingly. So getting back to some questions, and these are just kind of going to be random based on different topics and that have just come in since we've been speaking. So, and forgive me if I know some of these questions are sort of reworded, so you might have already covered it, but I think it's good anyway that students hear responses again. So if my grades aren't great, so they're still 85 or above, and I don't have publications yet, but I have a bunch of awards and leadership, mentorship experience from other things on my CV, what would my chances be? Would I still be considered competitive? Kirsten, you're still on my screen, so if you'd like to address that.
So yes, it's possible that you could be competitive. I wouldn't know for sure, and it really depends on the pool that is applying every single year, and we don't know what that pool looks like until we've received all those applications. But leadership is a component of these scholarships. Grades are also a component, but your written proposal and how you're presenting your entire package is also an element that's weighed in there. So and again, I go back to the point I made earlier that this is all good practice. It's good practice to get scholarship applications in. You can reuse those applications with modification the next year or for other types of awards. And we don't know if you're applying for the doctoral one, you could get sent to the national level and be evaluated there. The pool's going to look different up there as well. So I again, like Liz noted, it doesn't hurt to apply. You can't win an award if you haven't applied for it. Is generally the rule of thumb that I have. Liz, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I would just say that if look at the selection criteria for the award. So if you look at, say, the doctoral awards for Tri-Council, it's 50% research potential and then 50% relevant experience. And that relevant experience encompasses a wide range of things like participation in clubs or sports or showing leadership in your community or community outreach in some particular area. And so those things, I think historically, like in the past, we weren't bringing in those aspects of applicants' experiences because they weren't part of that selection criteria, but more and more scholarships are including those aspects. So I would say if you have a lot of experience that's outside of academia and you don't just, you don't have the publications yet, that there is still a chance that you could get it, and it's definitely worthy to apply for it.
That's
take
great.
Yeah, and I would say take a look at the list of all the different activities that are seen as valuable enough to report on them in your application, because they might kind of make you think about things that you didn't even think of including initially on that. And then again, make it clear what was important about that work. So don't just repeat what you have on your CV, but tell us about what was important about that activity.
Great. Yeah, and I think it is really important, like you keep saying, you don't know what the candidate pool is like. And so whatever experience you have might still be more than what somebody else has. And so I think if you've participated on the Graduate Student Association, whether it's, at your faculty level or institutionally, there's the Graduate Student Endowment Fund committee as well, or, different even intramural activities, anything that can demonstrate your participation, but even more so your leadership on those organizations and committees can only add to your overall package, I think, and help you stand out from others. So I think that's really great. And I think students, shouldn't be shy. We don't want to see, in my mind, like you sort of padding your application. You still want to look at what are the criteria of the award and make sure that the experience that you are adding to your application just helps round you out as a person and as a candidate. So
yeah, so just to add to that, I think your
Sure.
point about the application package is important. It's not like there's any sort of screening where it's like, does someone doesn't have this number of publications, we're not even going to consider them further. There's so many different elements to these applications, and we look at them as a whole, so that strength in one area can make up for like relative weakness in another area. And so it's not like anything other than spelling errors, which, check your typos, will rule you out of a competition. Yeah.
That's really valid, because I think the competitions, the instructions also indicate like presentation standards, right? And I think that also demonstrates your attention to those, and following the instructions demonstrates your communication skills and ability to follow instructions. So if there are page limits, do not exceed the page limits. Check your spelling, check your grammar. If you're not sure, have a peer review your package, and your supervisor, or if you don't have a supervisor yet, the Writing Communication Center. They're wonderful people there. They've got lots of experience in reviewing these applications. So you're really trying to put your best foot forward, and we don't want to see things where there's typos and grammatical errors, because I just feel like that's just, it really dampers your application.
One thing that I'll add, not only going over pages, but don't go under pages. Like in your proposal, don't leave half a page blank because you feel like you've said all you need to say, because a committee will say, well, I wasn't really sure about what they were going to do here, and they had all this space and they didn't tell me about it. So use the space that you are given and don't go over.
Yeah, I just want to, you might think that this focus on spelling is kind of over the top, but not having good spelling and not having good grammar and good presentation kind of sends a message that you don't care, right? And so you really want to spend time on making your package look really presentable. And yes, don't leave half a page, but also I'd also recommend leaving some white space. So having spaces between paragraphs so that it's not so completely dense where it's the reader who's having to read these proposals and go through reading maybe 50. You want yours to kind of stand out. You want it to convey all the information that's really important to the work that you're doing. So think about how you're using that space and what your presentation is like as well.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a question that I saw come in about what subheadings should I use? Well, you need to address, follow the instructions, and then set up your pages so that they are reader friendly. Like you say, we have seen research proposals where it's the text is so dense. It's just some bolded words, but every line is covered. And I think utilizing the subheadings or, accordingly, that just helps the reader follow along and says, okay, now we know that the applicant is going to be speaking about this part, So I think it makes for a more pleasant read overall.
Heidi, I
Yes.
don't know if there's been any questions about this, but I think it's something important to mention, which are the EDI considerations. So a proposal can really be strengthened by showing some thoughtfulness about EDI considerations, whether it's related to the research design or to the methodology or to the communities that it's impacted. So there are amazing resources through the Tri-Council websites for individuals to take a look at, where they can, it walks you through different questions related to would an EDI consideration be appropriate to talk about within these various aspects of the research process. There is a section in a lot of the applications to where you're asked specifically about that. But if there is a way to build it into your proposal, that is also appropriate to do so. And it's just, part of research ethics and making your work more applicable for a more inclusive community as well. So it makes sense to do that.
Great. Thank you for adding that, because yes, there is more and more coming out from the tri-agencies on EDI. So thank you for addressing that, Liz. So this is more about bibliography in the research proposal. How do I reference if I'm summarizing a lot from my readings, and does the bibliography need to be formatted in a particular way?
I don't think there's a format for the bibliography. I think there's a one-page limit, if I recall correctly. I think one of the ways that I like to see references, and that is a good utilization of space, is numbering them and then just using numbers for the references. But I don't think we have any criteria when it comes to how you format the references. You know, you might want to use APA, but again, thinking about space and how you can include the body of literature that you're going to be referring to. Liz, maybe you can mention about SSHRC if there's any criteria there, but in NSERC, we're pretty flexible with referencing.
That question comes up, I think, every year where people are asking about that. And because there's different norms for referencing across different disciplines, even within SSHRC, my understanding is there isn't a particular format that needs to be adopted for that.
Okay, thank you. Let's see here. Most scholarships emphasize the importance of showing leadership and mentorship capabilities. My question is, what are examples of the activities that can strengthen leadership experience and expertise, and how can students work towards building this aspect of their resume? Any thoughts on that, Liz?
Yeah, so I think there's two aspects to that question. One is, how do we report on what is already there? And then how do we sort of move forward, thinking ahead at future applications, and how do we build that out? So it goes back to what I was talking about before, which is not just tell us not only what role that you had, but what you did in that role. So let's say you were orientation coordinator for incoming students. That doesn't really tell us what you do, but if you did something like, I organized events, I supported students as they moved into their residences, I provided a resource document for students about how to find housing in Waterloo. So that takes it from the role that you had to show how you thought about people who you were supporting, and engaged them with them in a way that rose your level to that of a leader. And that example I gave about a TA position. So some TA positions are primarily marking exams. Some are leading different tutorials and leading labs. So make that differentiation so that you are telling us about if you did things where you were supporting students in some particular way. Moving forward, I would say get involved in your student committees within your department, within your faculty, within the university, and then you can not only be a member of that committee, but you can take on roles like the treasurer for that committee, or the chair for that committee. And that's another way. And then what did you do? What did the committee do that was demonstrating something? So talk about those in there. And then, of course, there's leadership roles that people have through their co-op experiences in their undergrad that they can speak to, or supporting junior students within a lab as part of their research activities. Did they co-supervise an honors student or a directed studies student? Did they train incoming volunteers? Those are all examples of leadership, showing leadership and supporting others.
And there's even examples outside of the institution. So if there is a society that's affiliated with your field, in many science areas, there are scientific societies, and there are opportunities for graduate students to sit on committees that are evaluating student awards or evaluating student presentations, or even on executive committees within societies. So there's those opportunities. But I also don't want to discount some of the community experiences. So being a leader within your local community, whether it be an Indigenous community, whether it be a regional community, however, maybe you're participating, maybe you're doing climate change research at the university and you're involved in in conservation that's happening in the community. So there's many different routes that you can kind of take that can fill that kind of leadership experience on your application.
Great, thank you both. So we know that students are always very busy. They've got a lot going on. There's a lot of pressure. So we do have a student who's asking, how much time would you say we should expect to devote to applying for scholarships? You know, they're trying to prioritize their research, their classes. We have to think about what our chances are versus how much time we take away from our research to prepare this. Any thoughts? I know that you've said numerous times about it's important to apply. It's your opportunity. It's practice. The other thing is we want to encourage students to apply for these because if they're successful, it's wonderful to put on the CV because this is funding that you've actually earned on your own merit. It's not a GRS that you're getting that's paid from your supervisor's grant. This is something that you earned, you know, based on your application profile. So do you have any other comments to add to this about how long they could expect to devote?
Getting scholarships gives you more scholarships. It really looks great on your when you apply for, you get say an NSERC CGSM and then you apply for another award. Those things are recognized and they have kind of a cumulative effect. So as far as time wise, I don't know that I have a good idea of how long you should spend on an application. I think what's more important is getting your supervisor or other people or the writing center to really help you make sure that you're putting together a good package. And of course, attending this and hearing all the answers to these questions. But getting a scholarship in one area can help you. If you get a CGSM, it could help you get a CGSM for the doctoral level. It could help you get an NSERC postdoctoral fellowship or other types of maybe smaller awards that are institutional, provincial, or even national. But I can't give you a time because it's different for every person depending on how good a writer you are and what resources you're using around you. Liz, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I don't think I'd be able to put a time on it either because I would never recommend that someone just does it all in one chunk because I don't think that's going to produce a good application. I would say, you know, work on a section, walk away from it for a bit, then come back to it and have fresh eyes on it. So I would say give yourself several weeks leading up to the deadline to start working on it so that you can go through different drafts and just think of it not so much as this big sprint that you do right at the end before the deadline, even though it often ends up being that, but try not to aim for that, but instead think of it as like a longer sort of walk that you are doing to get to that deadline and that you're slowly chipping at it over a larger chunk of time.
Yeah, I think, it is time intensive, but I think it's well worth the effort, like we've said about practicing, but yes, it's very important not to leave this to the last minute. Make sure you give the referees enough time as well, because referees are often academics and they're writing and preparing their own research grant applications. And your application is not the only one that they're probably providing a reference letter for. So make sure that you give them enough time to write a strong recommendation. We also have been asked in the past, I'm not sure what I want to do. I'm finishing off my master's. I don't know if I want to do a PhD. Should I apply or should I wait, until I'm actually, in my first year? Well, our recommendation is apply, because if you're successful, you can always turn it down. If you, go into the program and you didn't apply for that scholarship, well, then you're guaranteed, if you didn't apply, you're guaranteed not to get it. So, we always think, spend the time, read the instructions, put together the best application package you can. The other thing is we also recommend that students apply for both a tri-agency and the OGS in the same year. If you're successful with both, then normally a student would take the federal level scholarship because there's a little bit more prestige to it because it's a national level scholarship. It's also worth more money. So once you sort of have the base material, you can reutilize it for another package. You might, your references should be addressing the proper competition that you're applying for. But when you have your research proposal ready, like it's pretty much, you can use it for your tri-agency and OGS scholarship application. There's a student, after you were speaking about EDI, Liz, a student did ask a question. If there's anywhere we can or should talk about EDI considerations about ourselves, not just the research process.
Yeah, so I believe there are some of the awards have certain sections where you can include that information. That's typically not the sort of information that you might include in a proposal unless it's relevant to the sort of work that you are doing. For instance, if you are hoping to do work with an equity deserving community, you might mention that you are a part of the community and this is the way that you are involved in the community and how you are going to engage in the community in that way. And I think that would be appropriate to include it in there, but I would look to see the guidelines. I believe for SSHRC in the allowable inclusions, there are certain a section about identifying yourself as Indigenous, and you can include some information there. But I would say include it within the research proposal if it's relevant to the research that you're doing.
Okay, thank you. Do undergrad entrance scholarships matter on a CV when you're already well into your PhD? So I'll tackle this initially. Again, based on the scholarship that you're applying for, you may be limited with how many scholarships that you can list in that section. So make sure that you prioritize the meritorious, more competitive based ones should be given priority and you should be listing. It's acceptable for you to also include scholarships that you've received at other institutions. It doesn't just need to be Waterloo-based scholarships. We suggest not listing needs-based awards or bursaries because they are based on financial need and nobody really needs to know that you received those. So we're really just trying to focus on academic-based awards or leadership awards that you might have received. But Kirsten or Liz, do you have any other comments on like the undergrad level awards?
I agree with you, Heidi, that prioritizing which awards that you received and choosing ones that were competitive are really advantageous to include on that one, and those that maybe might be recognized a little bit more broadly. But if you're running out of room, start doing that real kind of good look over the scholarships and decide which ones to include.
Okay.
Yeah, agree with both of you.
Okay, all righty, thank you. Somebody was just asking for a little bit more elaboration on these appointments with the faculty associate dean and what would specifically be discussed in the meeting. So this is the, so pre-COVID, we actually offered, I think it was for a couple of years, where we had a presentation. It was for the CGSM specifically. We had a presentation followed by breakout sessions with the with faculty members. So if you were in the Faculty of Science and you wanted to speak with faculty members in science about your research proposal or your CV, how to maybe lay out your application or what things to include. So that was a really great opportunity to get more feedback on your application. So since we're still a lot in the virtual world, we've set up these appointments with the faculty associate dean. So it would still be, appointments are limited to 10 minutes. So you really want to kind of go in with specific questions about, maybe it is like, should I list this on my CV? Or here's how I was thinking about laying out my research proposal. Does that seem reasonable? Or, maybe they have other questions about their special circumstances that they want to address. But so it's very similar kind of what we're doing here. We're allowing students to ask their questions of academic experts who have participated in evaluating these scholarship applications before, but these appointments would simply be one-on-one with your faculty associate dean. Again, since we've been speaking for this last hour and a half, I imagine maybe those appointments are all booked by now, but feel free to go and check out the link, have a look, and if there's an appointment still available, feel free to book that. If they are all booked, again, we've got the other resources available, like the Writing and Communication Center. You're welcome to reach out to your own supervisor, your graduate officer or associate chair in the department for input. Let's see here. Coming back to publications. Liz, you're still on my screen, so I'll ask you, but Kirsten, feel free to jump in from a science perspective. How do you assess students who are not required to publish as part of their program?
Yeah, so again, there can be outputs that are across all sorts of areas. They don't have to be in an academic journal. So is there some sort of creative output? Is there some sort of written piece that was done? Is there some sort of community outreach? Those are all things that count in that same section that wouldn't necessarily be a publication. And so I think what you want to demonstrate is that you are engaged with your work in some meaningful way. Publication is one way to show that engagement, but there are other ways to demonstrate that. And we would take into consideration where there tends to be fewer publications from a particular area. I would say most areas support their students in publishing, but I think the degree to which the rate and frequency of publication is going to differ across disciplines. And we take that into account.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. Also within the sciences and engineering, there can be technical reports or government reports that you may have contributed to and been a major part of the work that you're doing. And those things are really relevant to include as well. But typically within the sciences, peer-reviewed publishing is generally the norm, but technical reports and government reports and things like that are also really relevant, and include them.
Okay. And sometimes we get asked this about whether undergrad or master's theses should be listed as a publication. What's your recommendation with that, Liz? Kirsten, rather.
So I would say those are major documents that you would have written and you would have included, and they would have been primarily your written work. Those would be relevant to include in your documents. I think for the most part, if you're doing a thesis-based graduate master's, then we would have expected to see your master's thesis included in there. And it might be that you're continuing your PhD work in that general area, so then you can refer back to your thesis, even though you might have not published components of that yet. Liz, any thoughts on that one?
I would say that's one where it's kind of neither here nor there, whether you include it or you don't, because we would be able to see from your education whether that happened or did not happen. I think if there's relevant aspects to the work that you did, you might include some of those in where you're able to expand on the work that you have, if there's some meaningful experiences from it. But in terms of listing it as a document, I don't know whether it would really tip the balance so much in terms of the strength of your application, because we would expect people who came out of a master's program, especially a research-based master's program, would produce either a thesis or a major research paper, and we'd kind of know based on the program what their expectations were.
Okay, thank you. Coming back to a special circumstance question, and our questions are winding down, so I'm just letting you know that. But a few more here. let's say we had an undiagnosed learning disorder that affected only one grade, but we didn't find out about it until years later, but it's still showing up on the transcript. Is there any need to address that, or how should they go about addressing that?
I think that would depend on whether like how far in the past that grade was there. I mean, if it's something that is in your first year of your undergrad, that there was this impact, I don't know, when we're looking at someone's sort of potential in graduate training, that we look at, if anything, seeing students who don't do well in their first year and then do a little bit better in their second year and then even better in the third and then end in their fourth year in a really strong way. That sort of trajectory is seen in a really positive way. So I'd say, like, where exactly is that occurring? And then decide whether or not that it's important to mention that. Yeah, if it's something that is going to be impacting the GPA that is calculated for your awards, then you might want to mention it. But if it's something that's quite far back, I don't know if it would be worth it. I mean, it's up to you to make that choice.
Okay, and sorry, Liz, another EDI question for you. Okay. If the student's research is based on materials for industrial applications, is there a need to even mention EDI? And I just recall receiving, because we've just gone through the Banting competition, or we're just wrapping it up, and there was a question, does your research include EDI? And it was, no, my research is math. It was just very brief like that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that your research topic still won't include EDI. So how can they elaborate on that? Or is there really like a way for them to sort of justify how it does not take EDI into consideration?
Yeah, so I think that you can provide a statement kind of clarifying why it doesn't. And I don't think it makes sense to include that information and try to sort of force it to work with that. But I would encourage students to look at the resources and to ask the questions at each stage of the design, or at each stage of the research process, because it might be the case that when you get to the point of disseminating that information, that there are some considerations that they are going to make, even if during the actual process of the experimentation or something like that, it wasn't relevant to that. So they can take a look at that, just to see it, that at each stage that it's not relevant, not just at that testing stage.
Right. Okay, thank you. All right, well, it appears that we have come to the end of our questions that have been asked live. So I would sincerely like to thank everybody, all of the attendees, for joining us, as well as my sincere appreciation to my GSPA colleagues, Kirsten and Liz, and Elena, Miranda, Laura, Sarah, Olivia. Thank you very, very much for all of your help and for taking the time to answer so many questions. If we were not able to answer your questions at today's session, or you have follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to your department coordinator or graduate officer or associate chair, or your supervisor for assistance. Sarah, if you could please add the links to the grad coordinators and graduate officers in the chat, that would be great. A recording of this presentation will be posted to our scholarship competition resources webpage within hopefully the next week. Sarah, once again, if you could please add the link to our scholarship resources page in the chat. And on this page, you will also find details about our future events and supports. I do understand that, let's see here, all All of the faculties except for engineering and environment still do have some faculty associate dean appointments left for September 15th. That's this Thursday. So if you are looking to have some more specific questions answered, feel free to book one of those appointments as soon as possible. Other than that, Kirsten or Liz, do you have any sort of closing comments or suggestions?
I don't have any more suggestions, but I would just like to wish all of our attendees good luck and best wishes. And I hope that the process is really valuable regardless of the outcome.
And I'll just echo those sentiments, and good luck on your applications, and all the best. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you again so very, very much. Appreciate your participation in the event. And to our attendees, I wish you the best of luck as well. And please enjoy the rest of your day and good luck. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.